So for China, I want to do a little bit differently. I'm going to intermix some videos to explain some of the events for imperialism in China. And then we'll also kind of be looking at the fall of the Qing dynasty at the same time. So the fall of the dynasty that had set up in China. If you remember, in China, during time period 4 leading into time period 5, we're going to see the fall of the Mongols. And then when the Mongols fall, a new Chinese dynasty based on traditional Chinese Confucianism and such is going to be set up, the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty was overthrown by the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was another group of foreigners that came in, Manchurians. The Manchurians came in, they kept things like the civil service system, but they made the Chinese subservient to the Manchurians or the Manchu rulers. So this is the group that made Chinese men like braid their hair, grow their hair out and braid them. And even though they're ruled by a foreign power, the Qing dynasty was actually pretty stable, peaceful. They expanded China a bit more. But we start to see a high demand for Chinese luxury goods from the Europeans. And what the Qing dynasty decided to do was to allow Europe to come in, but they were only allowed to come in and trade in one port in the Canton system. They can come and trade in one port, and that's it. And this is going to set up the system of trade with Europe that we know from China. Sorry, that went crazy. So the Qing dynasty is really the last of the Chinese dynasties that falls due to internal issues and Western intervention. After this, we see China setting up democracies and everything like that. So some domestic issues within the Qing dynasty. We're going to see some environmental problems, large number of homeless people, and unemployment moving. And we see this because their population is going to boom so much. They almost can't fit everyone anymore. We see a lot of continuous rebellions throughout the country against Qing rule. One of those rebellions was the White Lotus Rebellion. They wanted the Ming dynasty to be restored. And it ignites a lot of instabilities in the Qing dynasty. We're going to see foreign conquerors kind of exploit this a little bit. In terms of trade, I just want to go back and talk about trade between Europe and China. And I want you to watch a video on tea. This video will help you kind of understand how these products became global.
During a long day spent roaming the forest in search of edible grains and herbs, the weary divine farmer, Shen Nong, accidentally poisoned himself 72 times. But before the poisons could end his life, a leaf drifted into his mouth. He chewed on it, and it revived him. And that is how we discovered tea. Or so an ancient legend goes, at least. Tea doesn't actually cure poisonings, but the story of Shen Nong, the mythical Chinese inventor of agriculture, highlights tea's importance to ancient China. Archaeological evidence suggests tea was first cultivated there as early as 6,000 years ago, or 1,500 years before the pharaohs built the Great Pyramids of Giza. That original Chinese tea plant is the same type that's grown around the world today, yet it was originally consumed very differently. It was eaten as a vegetable or cooked with grain porridge. Tea only shifted from food to drink 1,500 years ago, when people realized that a combination of heat and moisture could create a complex and varied taste out of the leafy green. After hundreds of years of variations to the preparation method, the standard became to heat tea, pack it into portable cakes, grind it into powder, mix with hot water, and create a beverage called mo cha, or matcha. Matcha became so popular that a distinct Chinese tea culture emerged. Tea was the subject of books and poetry, the favorite drink of emperors, and a medium for artists. They would draw extravagant pictures in the foam of the tea, very much like the espresso art you might see in coffee shops today. In the 9th century, during the Tang Dynasty, a Japanese monk brought the first tea plant to Japan. The Japanese eventually developed their own unique rituals around tea, leading to the creation of the Japanese tea ceremony. And in the 14th century, during the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese emperor shifted the standard from tea pressed into cakes to loose-leaf tea. At that point, China still held a virtual monopoly on the world's tea trees, making tea one of 3 essential Chinese export goods, along with porcelain and silk. This gave China a great deal of power and economic influence as tea drinking spread around the world. That spread began in earnest around the early 1600s when Dutch traders brought tea to Europe in large quantities. Many credit Queen Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese noblewoman, for making tea popular with the English aristocracy when she married King Charles II in 1661. At the time, Great Britain was in the midst of expanding its colonial influence and becoming the new dominant world power. And as Great Britain grew, interest in tea spread around the world. By 1700, tea in Europe sold for 10 times the price of coffee, and the plant was still only grown in China. The tea trade was so lucrative that the world's fastest sailboat, the clipper ship, was born out of intense competition between Western trading companies. All were racing to bring their tea back to Europe first to maximize their profits. At first, Britain paid for all this Chinese tea with silver. When that proved too expensive, they suggested trading tea for another substance, opium. This triggered a public health problem within China, as people became addicted to the drug. Then, in 1839, a Chinese official ordered his men to destroy massive British shipments of opium as a statement against Britain's influence over China. This act triggered the First Opium War between the two nations. Fighting raged up and down the Chinese coast until 1842, when the defeated Qing dynasty ceded the port of Hong Kong to the British and resumed trading on unfavorable terms. The war weakened China's global standing for over a century. The British East India Company also wanted to be able to grow tea themselves and further control the market. So they commissioned botanist Robert Fortune to steal tea from China in a covert operation. He disguised himself and took a perilous journey through China's mountainous tea regions, eventually smuggling tea trees and experienced tea workers into Darjeeling, India. From there, the plant spread further still, helping drive tea's rapid growth as an everyday commodity. Today, tea is the second most consumed beverage in the world, after water, and from sugary Turkish Riza tea to salty Tibetan butter tea, there are almost as many ways of preparing the beverage as there are cultures on the globe.
So that's just an example of how one product can have such a transformative role in history. And what we'll see in terms of trade, which you guys are familiar with, is that China always wanted to regulate foreigners who were coming into their country. They wanted a favorable balance of trade with other nations. So they had only been allowing Europeans to come into one city to trade. And where we see this shift changing is with the resource opium. Opium was grown in the Ottoman Empire and in India, and the British are going to get their hands on a lot of opium. And in 1729, there's going to be a Chinese law banning opium imports because the British were coming in, and now instead of just bringing silver, they're going to start bringing opium. And so many Chinese people were buying opium that they say like 50% of the population was getting addicted to opium. So they wanted to outlaw it to really protect their citizens. And the British just kept saying no. The British kept saying, we're going to keep trading it. If not, it's going to be smuggled in. And so this creates a lot of conflict. And it opens up into what we call the Opium Wars. Britain considered the laws against opium too much of a limitation on their trade. So they're going to start wars with the Qing government, where we see bombardments of China and we see British fleets sent to Chinese ports. And unfortunately, the Qing military is going to be very weak compared to the British military, especially the Navy. Their weapons were just obsolete compared to European weapons. Their Navy couldn't compete. So here's a quick video on the Opium Wars that I want you to see. Oh, first, at the end of the wars, there's going to be a treaty signed, the Treaty of Nanking, and it dismantles the old system of only having one city where Europeans could trade in and increased the number of ports from 1 to 5, made Hong Kong an official British colony. So England's going to become almost like a protectorate again of China. British residents in China get certain rights. China was forced to pay 21 million ounces of silver to Britain as a penalty for starting and instigating the war. And so we see China becoming a sphere of influence for Britain. European nations now can control different ports of trade within China, which China was trying so hard to fight against. So here's the video on the Opium Wars.
Direct trade between European nations and China began in the 16th century, but European nations could only enter Canton in southern China and deal with the Kohong, a group of Chinese merchants. Plus, Chinese products, in particular tea, was only sold for silver, and this created a trade deficit during the 18th century for the Europeans. So, to counter this imbalance, the British East India Company began to sell Indian-grown opium to the Chinese. Due to bribes and taxes, Chinese officials initially tolerated the trade. However, by the 1830s there were millions of addicts and the flow of silver had reversed in Britain's favour. So, in 1839 the Daoguang Emperor tasked Lin Jie-shu with clamping down on the trade. Lin quickly closed off the routes to Canton, blockading the British within the city, and boarded British merchant vessels. The British merchants were told by their own government to hand over the opium in exchange for promised reparations. Lin went ahead and destroyed the opium and reopened trade with the British, but tried to get the merchants to sign a guarantee against trading in opium or risk facing death. Although some traders were willing to oblige, the British government, who now favoured free trade, refused to acknowledge this agreement and believed that the Chinese should compensate their traders. So, in November 1839, the Royal Navy fired warning shots at a British merchant vessel which was trying to trade with China. The Chinese deployed ships to protect the vessel, but were subsequently crushed by the technologically superior British Navy. Then, despite many in the British government arguing against the opium trade on moral grounds, the British declared war on China in January 1840, seeking to restore prestige and enforce free trade. By June, a British naval force had blockaded the Pearl River in the south, while another sailed north to demand compensation from the Qing dynasty. This fleet was easily able to capture Chusan and Tianjin on the coast and relay their demands onto the emperor. The Chinese tried to negotiate peace in late 1840, but the British demands of reparations, secession of an island, and the opening of more ports for trade proved to be too much. So, in January 1841, the British attacked, won a quick victory at Chunpei, and threatened Canton itself. The new governor of Guangdong agreed to give Britain Hong Kong, then a relatively uninhabited island, but this was rejected by the emperor, forcing the British to intensify their war effort once again. After accepting money from the officials of Canton in exchange for a truce, the British sailed north and, over the next year, took a series of coastal cities. The Chinese finally had to admit defeat, give in to British demands, and sign the Treaty of Nanjing. 5 cities were opened up to foreign trade, reparations were paid, opium continued to be sold, and Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. Following the First War, China was forced to sign a series of unequal treaties with Western powers, and the knock to prestige led to a series of uprisings. However, Britain still sought more from China, such as the legalization of opium and the opening of all of China to merchants, so they looked for a reason to go to war. Finally, in 1856, the Chinese crew on the Arrow, a ship which was registered in Hong Kong, were arrested on charges of smuggling, thus giving the British a cause for war. In November, in the Pearl River, the Chinese once again lost to the British, and they made matters worse for themselves by firing upon American ships, forcing the US to retaliate militarily, albeit briefly. However, the British momentum was lost due to a rebellion in India, but in the meantime, the British did manage to gain the support of the French. Hostilities resumed in late 1857 when the Western Allies quickly captured Canton. Then, in May 1858, they bombarded the Taku forts in the north by Tianjin, forcing the new Xianfeng emperor to the negotiating table. As part of the peace, more cities were opened to foreign merchants, and Beijing would open diplomatic legations for the British, Americans, and French. However, a year after signing the treaty, the Western powers received word that the emperor was going to deny them entry to Beijing to set up their legations. So the Allies attacked Taku forts once again. But this ended in a humiliating defeat for the Westerners, due in large part to the armies were imprisoned and tortured by the Chinese. Angered, the Allies forced their way into Beijing and burned the summer palace to the ground in October. The Chinese quickly signed the Convention of Peking, promising more freedom to foreigners. After the war, the Allies did lend the Qing dynasty support in crushing the ongoing Taiping Rebellion, and many Western advisors were sent to help the Chinese during their much-needed modernization of their military. But the Opium Wars will be remembered as the start of China's century of humiliation, 100 years of rebellions and lost wars.
So we see there in the Opium Wars, China being almost forced to open up their nation to trade. I want to compare it to Japan. We talked about industrialization with the Meiji Restoration, where the Meiji became more open to European ideas just by wanting to industrialize. This is going to be different because this is going to be a little bit more forced. So we start to see colonial powers divide up China, which China had been fighting for so long. And this is an example of a famous political cartoon that looks like those that we looked at in Africa, where there's European powers are coming in and cutting up pieces of China. And here you see a Qing or a Manchurian official trying to stop them from doing that. The video also mentioned that at the same time as the Opium Wars were happening, something called the Taiping Rebellion was happening. The Taiping Rebellion was a Chinese ethnic rebellion against the Qing rulers that also was going to work to weaken the Qing dynasty. The leaders of the Taiping Rebellion thought that the Qing were letting foreigners in too easily and giving up too easily, and so they were rejecting Qing rule. And we see it started by a peasant who failed the civil service exam, and he becomes almost like he thinks he's a prophet of Christianity, and he starts to want to push Manchurian rule out of China. And the government, the Qing dynasty, is going to have to not only, be fighting the Opium Wars, but now they're going to have to be fighting against this rebellion. And we see it move throughout the country and gain momentum. The Qing are eventually going to defeat the rebellion, but we still see it's going to leave a lot of negative influences in China. It ranks as the world's bloodiest civil war. Potentially 20 to 30 million people died. That led to a serious outbreak of plague all throughout the region, devastated agricultural regions in China, and we see major damage done to a lot of infrastructure and architecture within China because of this rebellion. But we also see it lead to a lot of self-strengthening movements where China is going to want to build up their nationalism. They're going to start to face a lot of the issues that were being seen. Chinese leaders are going to try to reinvigorate traditional China while also borrowing very cautiously ideas from the West. So there's this keeping traditional China, Confucianism, Taoism, civil service system, but bringing in some of that industrialization. So we see a few reforms happen in China after the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. We see advances in military and training of artisans to produce war supplies, try to relieve debts for people, especially after that huge silver debacle from time period 4, and then collecting taxes on imports and exports a little bit more carefully. We also see a reform in their civil service system. We see some reforms where they're almost going to try to abandon the civil service system and resist industrialization. So China doesn't industrialize the same way as the West does. Finally, in terms of foreign influence, one thing that upsets a lot of Chinese people is when the Europeans came in and tried to preach and force Christianity on them. And this is where we're going to see the Boxer Rebellion break out. And it was led by a militia called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, who are going to use martial arts and other violence to try to intimidate foreigners. And we're going to watch a video, so I'm not going to show you too much on this slide, but they're going to go around and they're going to try to kill or intimidate Europeans and Chinese Christians. And eventually the rebellion is going to be defeated, but it makes China kind of seen on a world scene of resistance against imperialism. And Europeans are still going to keep their sphere of influence in China. So here's a video on the Boxer Rebellion.
In the 19th century, foreign nations had been encroaching into China during their century of humiliation. Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Germany, and other nations had established foreign enclaves, concessions, and spheres of influence in China. The Chinese didn't welcome the foreigners and modernization and religion that they brought with them. In response, the men from Shandong banded together in 1898 and formed the Righteous and Harmonious Society. They claimed spirit possessions made them invincible and would impress locals by putting on performances and displaying their martial arts skills, for which they earned their nickname, Boxers. Between 100,000 and 300,000 men, who were mainly young and unemployed, would join the Boxers during the uprising. Violence erupted in the late 1890s. Boxers and similar groups attacked churches and missionaries. Shortly afterwards, a small group of Boxers clashed with the Qing dynasty forces. However, in the wake of the battle, the Boxers ordered, support the Qing, destroy the foreigners. 1898 also saw Empress Dowager Cixi seize power after failed modernization policies. In 1900, she issued edicts defending the Boxers with the hope that they would help rid China of foreign influence. The ever-increasing Boxers then started to move from Shandong towards Beijing. In May 1900, European diplomats called for assistance to defend the foreign quarters of the city, but only 400 naval troops from 8 separate nations were able to make it to Beijing. They came from Britain, USA, Japan, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Russia. As small-scale fighting broke out in the capital between the Boxers and the foreign troops, even more reinforcements were requested. 2,000 troops in total, from the same 8 nations as before, landed in Tianjin and began to make their way to Beijing. However, they had not asked permission to land, which upset the Qing dynasty, who now saw it as an invasion. The Chinese government now finally decided to align themselves with the Boxers and drive the foreigners out. The new alliance of the government and the Boxers were able to defeat the invading troops in battle and force them to retreat. Back in Beijing, on June the 20th, the siege of the legation quarters officially began. The legation quarters were located right next to the Forbidden City, where the Empress Dowager lived. Inside, only around 400 troops protected 400 foreign civilians and 3,000 Chinese Christians. Although the Chinese had tens of thousands of men at their disposal, they first tried to burn the defenders out. Then, their small assaults were fended off. Meanwhile, in the north, 100,000 Russian troops moved into Manchuria. They crushed the Boxers who had been harassing the construction of the Russian railway line in the region, and within a couple months, they occupied all of Manchuria. In Tianjin, 50,000 troops from 8 nations had been building troop numbers for a while, and on July 14th, this major force prepared to move to Beijing to relieve the besieged. The released force made it into Beijing in mid-August and defeated the Chinese in the city, ending the 55-day-long siege. The fighting finished, however, there were numerous atrocities committed after the war. Looting, rape, and killings were commonplace. The Empress Dowager had already fled the city, and there was no desire to continue the war. The peace treaty forced the Chinese to pay war reparations and give Western powers even more enclaves and concessions. Russia continued to occupy Manchuria, and this resulted in the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War a couple years later. For the Chinese, this war was just another war which weakened the dynasty and helped pave the way for the revolution of 1911.
Okay, so that's a focus on the Boxer Rebellion. Just a couple more issues with China. The United States tried to come into China and create what they called an open door policy. And this worked pretty well. It was a U.S. official named John Hay. He came into China and said, you know what, there should be no more sphere of influence. China should have a completely open door policy where everyone has equal trading rights in China. Even though they brought him in and were slightly receptive to his ideas, this was really unsuccessful. And then we see that Russo-Japanese War affecting regions of China like Manchuria in the north. So here, unfortunately, this is an image of a representation of the fall of the Qing dynasty. You see the typical Manchurian braid, so you can tell that it's Qing dynasty China. And it's all of these other nations coming in and it taking pieces of China and expecting to trade. And what we really see as a result is the death of the Qing dynasty there.